The observation hall of the starfall. Accord was the most beautiful place Danny Cole had ever stood in. The walls were made of something that looked like glass but felt alive, shifting between deep blue and soft gold, depending on the angle of the light. Beyond the walls, the stars stretched out in every direction. It was the kind of view that made a man feel very small and very lucky at the same time. Danny didn't belong here. He knew that he was a sergeant in the United Earth Defense Corps, 29 years old, with dust still under his fingernails from his last deployment on a mining colony. He had been assigned to the diplomatic security detail 3 weeks ago because someone higher up thought it would be good to have a few human soldiers visible during the peace summit, a show of cooperation. They called it. Danny called it standing around in a clean uniform, trying not to touch anything expensive. The Starfall Accord was a joint vessel built by both humans and Etherans as a symbol of the fragile peace between the two civilizations. The Etherans were an old species. Ancient, really. They had been traveling between stars when humans were still figuring out fire. They were tall, lean, and moved with a kind of grace that made every human nearby look like they were stumbling. Their skin had a faint silver shimmer to it, and their eyes were large and dark like deep water. They spoke softly, dressed in layered robes, and carried themselves as if the universe had been designed specifically for them. Danny respected them. He also found them a little intimidating, though he would never say that out loud. The peace summit had been going on for 6 days. Diplomats from both sides sat in long sessions talking about trade routes, shared borders, and old grievances. Danny understood almost none of it. His job was to stand near the door, look alert, and stay out of the way. Lieutenant Megan Shaw, his commanding officer and the closest thing he had to a best friend in the Corps, stood on the other side of the hall doing the same thing. She caught his eye and gave him a look that said she was just as bored as he was. The real security belonged to the Etheran Royal Guard. They were called the Vithari, and they were something else entirely. Each one stood over 7 ft tall, armored in dark plates that seemed to absorb light. They carried long curved blades on their backs and plasma weapons on their hips. Their commander, High Sentinel Rake, was the tallest of them all. He had a scar running down the left side of his face, and he looked at the human soldiers the way a hawk looks at sparrows, not with hatred exactly, more like mild disappointment. Danny had tried to introduce himself on the first day. Rick had stared at him for a full 5 seconds, said nothing, and walked away. Danny decided not to try again. Today was the ceremonial walk. Empress Viathari's son, the sovereign ruler of the Etheran Dominion, was making a formal passage through the observation hall to mark the midpoint of the summit. It was a tradition, her advisors had explained, a gesture of openness and trust. She would walk slowly through the hall, flanked by her guard, while delegates from both sides stood along the edges and bowed their heads. Danny had seen the Empress only once before, from a distance, during the opening ceremony. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with presence. She was tall, even for an Atheran, with sharp features and silver white hair that fell past her shoulders. Her robes were deep violet, layered and heavy with symbols he didn't understand. When she entered a room, the air seemed to change. Conversation stopped. She entered the observation hall now, and the same thing happened, the delegates along the walls lowered their heads. The Vithari formed a perfect line behind her. Rith walked at her right shoulder, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Danny lowered his head like everyone else. He watched through the corner of his eye as the Empress moved down the hall, her steps slow and measured. She looked calm, serene even. And then Danny saw something that no one else saw. There was a narrow service alcove set into the far wall, partially hidden behind a decorative column. Panels there had been removed. Danny noticed it because he always noticed things like that, loose panels, open vents, blind spots. It was the kind of habit that came from years of working in places where people tried to kill each other. He saw the shape of a hand, then the barrel of a weapon. He didn't have time to shout a warning or radio anyone. His body moved before his brain caught up. He pushed off the wall and ran. He crossed the distance in 4 long strides, putting himself between the Empress and the alcove. Just as the plasma lance fired, the beam hit him square in the chest. The impact was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was not pain, not at first. It was heat and pressure and a sound like the air being torn apart. His armor cracked and split. The force threw him backward and he hit the floor hard, sliding several feet before stopping. Then the pain came and it was everything. The hall exploded into motion. The Vithari surged toward the alcove. Ryak was the first to reach the assassin, and it was over in seconds. Danny heard the sound of the blade, and then nothing from the alcove. Megan was at his side before anyone else. She dropped to her knees and pressed her hands against his chest, trying to hold together armor that was no longer in one piece. Her face was white. She was saying his name over and over, but her voice sounded far away. Danny tried to speak but couldn't. The ceiling above him was that same shifting glass, blue and gold, and the stars beyond it were impossibly bright. He thought it was a strange thing to notice while dying. Etheran medics arrived within moments, followed by the human medical team. They lifted him onto a hovering stretcher and rushed him out of the hall. Megan ran beside him, holding his hand. She was shouting orders at people who outranked her, and nobody stopped her. In the observation hall, the delegates stood frozen. The Empress had not moved from where she stood. The plasma bolt had passed so close to her that the edge of her robe was singed black. She stared at the spot where Danny had fallen. There was blood on the floor, human blood, red and stark against the pale surface. High Sentinel Rick returned to her side, his blade still drawn. He waited for her to speak. She looked at him and asked a single question. Why did he do that? Rick had no answer. He had served the Empress for 20 years. He had trained his entire life to be the one who stood between her and danger. And today, a human soldier, a man he had dismissed as irrelevant, had done what the entire Vithari Guard had failed to do. The Empress looked back at the blood on the floor. She said nothing more, but something had changed behind her eyes, something quiet and deep and impossible to undo. In the medical bay, Danny Cole's heart stopped for 47 seconds before they brought him back. Danny Cole spent 3 days floating between life and death inside a medical pod that was never designed for a human body. The Athathuran machines were meant for on biology, and the doctors had to guess their way through half the treatment. The human medical team did what they could from their side, feeding data into the pod and adjusting settings by hand, while the Athathuran physicians watched and offered quiet suggestions. The plasma lance had burned a hole through the center of his chest armor and scorched the tissue underneath. 2 of his ribs were cracked, part of his left lung had collapsed. The Athathuran doctors said it was remarkable that he was alive at all. Human bodies, they noted with what sounded like genuine surprise, were stubborn things. Megan Shaw did not leave the medical bay for those 3 days. She slept on a chair next to the pod, ate only when someone brought food to her, and snapped at anyone who suggested she go rest. She had known Danny since basic training. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, never complained, and never once hesitated when someone else was in danger. She had always admired that about him. She had also always feared it would get him killed. On the 4th morning, Danny opened his eyes. He couldn't speak at first. His throat was dry and his chest felt like it had been filled with broken glass. Megan leaned over him and told him he was an idiot. And then she held his hand and didn't let go for a long time. He asked what happened. She told him the short version. He had jumped in front of a plasma shot meant for the Athathuran Empress. The assassin was dead. Danny was alive barely, and everything since then had been very, very complicated. Danny didn't understand what she meant by complicated. He would find out soon enough. 3 decks above the medical bay, Ambassador Kevin Pratt was standing in the Empress's formal reception chamber, trying very hard to keep his face calm. Kevin was 52 years old, a career diplomat who had spent 20 years building bridges between Earth and alien civilizations. He was good at his job. He could read room, manage a crisis, and find the right words for almost any situation. This situation, however, was new. High Sentinel Riek stood to the left of the Empress's seat, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable. But Kevin had learned enough about Athathuran body language to notice the tension in his jaw and the slight tilt of his head. Riek was uncomfortable. That made Kevin uncomfortable too. The Empress sat on a raised chair at the center of the room. She wore white robes today, which Kevin had been told was a sign of deep reflection in Athathuran culture. Her face was still and composed, but her eyes moved with a sharpness that missed nothing. Kevin had come expecting a formal thank you, a statement of gratitude for Sergeant Cole's bravery, perhaps a combination or a symbolic gift. That was how these things worked in human diplomacy. Someone does something brave, you shake their hand, give them a medal, and move on. The Athatharans did not work that way. Rick was the one who spoke first. He explained in a voice that was careful and measured the ancient Athathuran tradition known as Shalom Vorath. Kevin listened, and as he listened, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. Shalom Vorath was the life debt. It was one of the oldest laws in the Athathuran civilization, older than the Dominion itself, older than their first journeys into space. The tradition stated that when a person saves the life of an Athathuran of high blood and does so without being asked and without expectation of reward, the saved owes the savior a debt that cannot be repaid with words or gifts. The debt was spiritual, it was political, it was absolute, and when the life saved was that of the sovereign, the debt was not just personal, it became the obligation of the entire Dominion, Kevin asked as politely as he could what exactly that meant in practical terms. Rick looked at the Empress. She gave a small nod and he continued, the life debt demanded that the Savior be elevated, not just thanked, not just honored, but brought into the inner circle of the one they saved. They were to be given standing, voice, and protection equal to the highest members of the court. The debt could not be dismissed, reduced, or negotiated. To refuse it or to allow it to go unfulfilled was considered the deepest shame in Etherean culture. It would mark the Empress and her entire bloodline as dishonorable for generations. Kevin felt his mouth go dry. He was beginning to understand why Rithik looked so tense. He asked one more question. What if Sergeant Cole didn't want any of this? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Kevin had ever heard. The Empress spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and clear, and it carried the weight of someone who had spent her entire life choosing words with precision. She said that she understood this was unexpected. She said that she herself had not anticipated such a situation. No Etha and sovereign had owed a life debt in over 600 years, and no life debt had ever been owed to someone outside their species. But the law was the law, and her people were watching. She told Kevin that she would meet with Sergeant Cole when he was well enough. She would explain the debt to him herself, and she hoped for the sake of both their civilizations that he would understand what was being asked of him. Kevin walked out of that chamber with the careful, measured steps of a man trying not to run. He went straight to the medical bay and found Megan sitting next to Danny and LT Unk and GT Wise Pod. He told them everything. Danny stared at him for a long time, then he looked at Megan, then he looked back at Kevin. He said he just didn't want to see the Empress get shot. That was all. He wasn't trying to start a political crisis. He wasn't trying to become part of anyone's court. He was a soldier. He saw a threat and he moved. That was it. Kevin sat down heavily in the nearest chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He said he understood. He said he believed Danny completely, but understanding didn't change the facts. In the eyes of the Etherean Dominion, Danny Cole had performed the most sacred act one being could do for another, and their oldest, deepest tradition now demanded more than Danny had ever imagined giving. Megan looked at Danny and saw the exact moment the weight of it hit him. His face didn't change much. It never did. But his eyes went quiet in a way she recognized, the same way they went quiet before a bad mission. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was in something he couldn't fight his way out of. She put her hand on his arm and told him they would figure it out. Danny nodded, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at the ceiling of the medical bay and wished more than anything that he had been a little slower that day in the observation hall. But he hadn't been. Danny was allowed to leave the medical pod after 6 days. He could walk, but slowly. His chest dogged with every breath, and the Athetherin doctors told him the tissue beneath his skin was still healing in ways that human medicine didn't fully understand. They had used their own treatments alongside the human ones, and the result was that Danny was alive but sore in places he didn't know a person could be sore. Megan walked beside him as he made his way down the corridor toward his assigned quarters. She kept one hand near his elbow, ready to catch him if he Stumbled, though she knew he would hate it if she actually did. Danny was the kind of man who would crawl before he let someone carry him. He hadn't said much since Kevin told him about the life debt. Megan could see him turning it over in his head the way he always did. With problems, Danny didn't panic. He didn't argue. He just went quiet and thought until he found something solid to stand on. The trouble was there didn't seem to be anything solid about this situation. The summons came that evening. A young ether attendant appeared at Danny and LT Unk and GT Y's door, dressed in pale robes with silver markings on her sleeves. She bowed low and told him in careful English that Empress Vieri Sonnen requested his presence in the formal court the following morning. Danny thanked her. After she left, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Megan found him like that. An hour later, she sat down next to him and asked him what he was thinking. He told her the truth. He wanted to refuse. Every part of him wanted to say no. He was not a politician. He was not a courtier. He didn't understand Etherean customs, and he didn't want to be part of some ancient tradition he had never heard of. He had saved the Empress because it was the right thing to do, and he didn't think the right thing to do should come with this kind of price. Megan listened. Then she told him the other truth, the one he didn't want to hear. Kevin had briefed her earlier that day. If Danny refused the life debt, it would be seen as the greatest insult in Atherin history. The Empress would be shamed before her entire civilization. The traditionalist factions in the Dominion, the ones who already distrusted humans, would use the refusal as proof that humanity was unworthy of respect or alliance. The peace summit would collapse. Years of diplomatic work would be destroyed. And the next time human and Atherin ships met in the dark between stars, it might not be for talking. Danny closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. He said nothing for a while. Then he asked Megan what she would do. She told him she would hate every second of it, but she would accept, not for glory, not for politics, but because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier could do was put down the weapon and pick up something heavier. Danny almost smiled at that. Almost. The next morning, he put on a clean uniform. It was the best one he had, which wasn't saying much. Megan straightened his collar and told him to stand up straight. Kevin met them at the entrance to the formal court and gave Danny a quick rundown of what to expect. Bo, when the Empress enters, don't speak until spoken to. Keep his answers short and respectful, and for the love of everything, don't scratch his nose during a ceremony. Danny told Kevin he couldn't promise anything. The formal court was a vast circular chamber at the heart of the Starfall Accord. The ceiling was open to the stars, or at least it looked that way. Rows of Etherean dignitaries sat on curved benches that rose in tiers around the center. The Vithari guard stood at every entrance, still and silent as statues. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and metallic, like flowers made of steel. Danny walked in alone. Kevin and Megan waited outside. This part he had to do by himself. Every eye in the chamber turned to look at him. He had never felt so many gazes in his life. The Athorans watched him with expressions he couldn't read. Some looked curious, some looked offended, some looked like they were seeing something they had never expected to see and hadn't yet decided how to feel about. He walked to the center of the chamber and stopped, his chest stock, but he stood straight. A deep tone rang through the room, and the Empress entered from a doorway behind the raised platform at the far end. She wore robes of deep black this time, trimmed with lines of silver that caught the light of the stars above. Her hair was pulled back and her face was composed in a way that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. She sat down and looked at Dany across the length of the chamber. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then she spoke. Her English was slow and deliberate, each word chosen with care. She told him that she had not slept well since the day in the observation hall. She told him that she had spent her entire life surrounded by people whose duty it was to protect her, and not one of them had moved as quickly as he had. She told him that she did not understand why human soldier, a man with no obligation to her, no bond to her people, and no reason to die for her, had chosen to step into the path of a weapon meant for her heart. Dany looked at her and said the only honest thing he could think of. He told her he saw the weapon and he moved. There was no decision, there was no thought. He just couldn't stand there and watch someone get killed when he could do something about it. It didn't matter that she was an empress. It didn't matter that she was Etherin. She was a person, and someone was trying to end her life, and he was close enough to stop it. The court was absolutely silent. The Empress studied him for a long moment. Then she said something that Dany didn't expect. She said she believed him. She said that his honesty was what made the debt so heavy, because a man who acts without thought of reward is exactly the kind of man the Sham Voreth was written for. She stood and extended her hand, palm up. In what Dany had been told was the Etherin gesture of binding trust. She offered him the title of Via Shael, a recognized protector of the sovereign. It had not been granted to anyone outside the Etherin species in over 1,000 years. Dany looked at her hand. He thought about Megan's words. He thought about Kevin's warnings. He thought about the soldiers on both sides who would suffer if he said no. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. The chamber erupted, not in applause, because that wasn't how Etherins expressed themselves, but in a low, resonant hum that rose from every throat. In the room, it was a sound Dany had never heard before. It vibrated in his chest and in his bones, and he felt it in the place where the plasma bolt had nearly killed him. Rick, standing at the edge of the platform, watched with an expression that was impossible to name. It was not approval. It was not anger. It was the look of a man watching his world shift beneath his feet and choosing for now to keep standing. Outside the chamber, Megan heard the hum. Through the walls, she looked at Kevin, who was pale and still. She asked him if Dany had just done what she thought he did. Kevin nodded slowly and said that Sergeant Dany Cole had just become the first human in history to hold a place in the Etherin royal court. Megan leaned against the wall and let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She whispered that Dany was still an idiot, but she was proud of him, terribly, painfully proud. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Dany Cole's life, and he had once spent 43 days pinned down on a moon with no air support and half a squad, at least. On that moon, he had known who the enemy was. In the Empress's court, the enemy wore silk and spoke in whispers. News of the life debt spread across both civilizations faster than any official announcement could control. On the Ethereum side, the reaction split right. Down the middle, the traditionalists, those who treated the old laws as sacred and untouchable, accepted the life debt because their faith demanded it, but accepting the law and accepting the human it now protected were two very different things. Many of them looked at Danny with the kind of politeness that felt worse than open hostility. They bowed when required, spoke the proper words, and then turned away with expressions that made it clear they considered his presence in their court stain on everything they held dear. The reformists, the younger factions who wanted the Dominion to modernize and engage more openly with other species, were fascinated by Danny. Some of them sought him out for conversation, asked him questions about Earth, about human culture, about why humans fought the way they did. Danny answered as honestly as he could, though he was never sure he was saying the right thing. On Earth, the reaction was just as divided. Politicians debated whether Danny had been manipulated. Military advisors questioned his judgment. News networks ran endless segments about the soldier who had accidentally tied himself to an alien queen. Some called him a hero. Others called him a liability. A senator from the eastern districts publicly asked whether Danny and LT Unk and GT Y's loyalty could still be trusted. Megan showed Danny the news feeds one evening. He watched for about 2 minutes, then asked her to turn it off. He said he didn't recognize the man they were talking about on those screens, and he didn't want to start. Kevin Pratt worked around the clock to manage the diplomatic fallout. He sent reports to Earth, held meetings with Atheran officials, and tried to keep both sides from doing anything reckless. He told Danny that the best thing he could do was be patient, be respectful, and not punch anyone, no matter how much they deserved it. Danny promised to try. The hardest part was Riek. The High Sentinel did not accept Danny quietly. He didn't challenge the life dead openly because that would have been a violation of his own code. But he made it clear in every other way that he considered Danny unworthy of the title he now held. A Vithari Shale was supposed to be a warrior of the highest order, tested and proven through decades of service. Danny was a human with a few years of combat experience and a hole in his chest that hadn't fully healed. Rick began with the combat trials. These were traditional tests that every member of the Royal Guard had passed, hand-to-hand combat against Ethereum fighters, tactical simulations on holographic battlefields, endurance marches through artificial environments that shifted between freezing cold and burning heat. Danny failed the first combat trial in under 30 seconds. The Ethereum fighter was faster, stronger, and had about 1.5 feet of reach on him. Danny hit the floor hard enough to see stars, and the court observers murmured among themselves. He got up and asked to go again. He lost the second round too, and the third, but each time he lasted a little longer. He learned to read the Ethereum fighting style, to predict the wide sweeping strikes, to use his lower center of gravity to duck and close the distance. On the 7th attempt, he managed to land a clean hit to his opponent's midsection before being thrown to the ground. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. The tactical simulations went better. Danny had spent years in real combat, not in training halls, and his instincts were sharp in ways the simulations could test. He made decisions quickly, adapted to changing conditions, and showed a talent for reading enemy movements that surprised even Rick. He didn't win every scenario, but he won enough to make the observers stop murmuring and start paying attention. The endurance trials nearly broke him. His body was still healing, and the Etheran standards were designed for a species that was physically superior to humans in almost every measurable way. Danny pushed through on willpower alone. He collapsed twice, both times he got back up. The second time he was bleeding from the nose, and his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. Rick watched it all. He said nothing, but Danny noticed that the high Sentinel's expression changed over the course of those weeks. It shifted from contempt to something more complicated. Not respect, not yet, but the absence of dismissal. Rick was beginning to see something in Danny that couldn't be measured by speed or strength. It was the refusal to stop. The Empress watched, too, though she was less obvious about it. She and Danny had begun to speak privately in the evenings, short conversations in a small garden aboard the Starfall Accord. The garden was filled with Etheran plants that glowed faintly in the low light, and the air smelled of something Danny couldn't name, but found calming. She asked him about Earth, not the politics or the military, but the place itself, about the sound of rain on a tin roof, about the way the sky turned orange and pink at sunset over flat ground. She listened with the careful attention of someone hearing about a world she had never seen but wanted to understand. He asked her about the Dominion. She told him about the weight of ruling a civilization that measured its history in tens of thousands of years. She said her people worshipped tradition the way humans worshipped freedom, and that both could become prisons if held too tightly. She admitted quietly that the life dead frightened her too, not because of Danny, but because of what it revealed. Her people had laws they had never expected to apply to someone outside their species, and now those laws were being tested. Danny told her he understood being trapped by something you didn't choose. She looked at him with those dark, deep eyes and said she believed he did. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Kevin arrived with news that changed everything. Etheran intelligence had been investigating the assassination attempt. The assassin had not acted alone. He belonged to a faction called the Veil Soreth, a group of Etheran purists who believed that Dominion had been weakened by contact with lesser species. The assassination had been only the first move in a larger plan. The Veil Soreth had been building strength in the outer territories for years, quietly gathering ships and soldiers loyal to their cause, the life debt, and Danny and LT Unk and GT Y's elevation to the court had given them exactly the spark they needed. They were framing it as proof that the Empress had surrendered Etheran sovereignty to a human. Their propaganda was spreading through the Dominion's communication networks, and support for their cause was growing. Kevin laid out the intelligence reports on the table. Ships moving toward the capital, communications intercepted between rebel commanders, a timeline that suggested the attack was not months away but weeks. Danny looked at the reports, then he looked at the Empress. She met his gaze for the first time since he had known her. He saw something behind her composure that looked like fear, not fear for herself, but fear for her people. He told her he wasn't going anywhere. Rick, who had been standing silently by the door, looked at Danny. For a long moment, neither of them Spoke, then Rick gave a single short nod. It was the smallest gesture Danny had ever seen, and it meant more than anything that had come before. The attack came during the festival of eternal light. It was the most sacred celebration in the Etherean calendar. 3-day event that marked the moment. Thousands of years ago, when the first Etherean ship had left their home world and touched the stars, every city in the Dominion lit up with glowing lanterns that floated into the sky. Music played. In the streets, families gathered. Soldiers put down their weapons. Vale Sorth chose this moment on purpose. They knew the Dominion's defenses would be relaxed. They knew the capital would be full of civilians, and they knew that striking during the most holy festival would send a message so loud that no one in the Dominion could ignore it. The first sign of trouble came from the orbital stations above the capital world. 3 Vale Sorth warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately fired on the station's defense grid. Within minutes, the stations went dark. The blockade was in place before anyone on the surface fully understood what was happening. Then the ground assault began. Rebel soldiers, wearing black armor stripped of all Dominion markings, landed in drop ships along the edges of the capital city. They moved fast and with purpose, heading straight for the palace. Their orders were simple: take the Empress, remove the human, and declare the life debt void. The old Dominion would be restored, they told their soldiers. Pure, untouched, strong. Danny was in the palace when the first explosion shook the walls. He had been eating a meal with Megan, who had stayed on as part of the human security detail and had refused every order to rotate back to Earth. She looked at him across the table when the lights flickered, and neither of them needed to say a word. They had been in enough bad situations together to know the sound of the world falling apart. They moved. Ryuk was already mobilizing the Vithari Guard. When Danny and Megan reached the command center, the High Sentinel stood over a holographic display of the capital, watching red markers spread across the map like a wound opening. His face was grim, but his voice was steady. He gave orders in rapid Etherean, directing guard units to defensive positions around the palace perimeter. He looked at Danny and for the first time spoke to him as an equal. He told Danny that the Eastern Corridor was the weakest point in the palace defense. The walls were thinner there, designed for ceremony rather than combat. If the rebels broke through, they would have a straight path to the Empress's chambers. Ryuk said he needed someone to hold that corridor, someone stubborn enough to stay when everything told them to run. Danny said he knew someone like that. Rick almost smiled. It was barely a movement, just the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth, but Danny saw it. Megan took a squad of human soldiers and joined the Vithari at the main gate. She told Danny to stay alive, and he told her the same thing, and they both knew it wasn't a promise either of them could keep. Danny took position in the Eastern Corridor with a mixed unit of Vafari warriors and the remaining human security detail. It was the strangest fighting force he had ever been part of. The Arans towered over the humans, carrying their curved blades and plasma rifles with the easy confidence of lifelong warriors. The humans carried standard-issue weapons and wore patched-together armor. They looked at the Ethereans, and the Ethereans looked at them, and for one quiet moment, nobody knew what to say. Danny told them all the same thing: hold The line, don't let anyone through. Protect each other, a Vithari warrior. Beside him repeated the words in Etherin for those who didn't speak English. Then they waited. The rebels hit the eastern corridor 20 minutes later. They came in hard and fast, pouring through a breach in the outer wall with plasma fire and concussion grenades. The corridor filled with light and noise and the terrible sound of bodies hitting the ground. Danny fought the way he had always fought, close, direct, and without hesitation. He fired from cover, moved when the cover broke, and pulled a wounded Vithari soldier behind a column when a plasma bolt took out the warrior's leg. The Etherin looked at him with wide, shocked eyes, and Danny told him to stay down and keep pressure on the wound. It bent, it buckled, but it held. Danny and the Vithari commander of his unit, a young officer named Tithe, coordinated the defense without needing many words. Tithe pointed, Danny moved, Danny called out enemy positions, Tithe directed fire. It was rough and imperfect and nothing like a textbook operation, but it worked. At the main gate, Megan and Rick fought side by side. Rick moved like nothing Danny had ever seen, his blade cutting arcs through the rebel lines with a speed that was almost beautiful. Megan stayed behind cover and put precise shots into every gap the high Sentinel created. They were an unlikely pair, but they kept the gate sealed. Inside the palace, Empress Vithari's son refused to leave. Her advisors begged her personal guard pleaded with her. She stood in the heart of the palace in the great hall where her ancestors had ruled for generations, and she said no running would mean that Vale Sorath had already won. If the Dominion was going to survive this night, it would be because its Empress stood her ground. She ordered the palace communication systems brought online. The rebels had jammed the orbital networks, but the ground relays still worked. The Empress walked to the broadcast platform, stood before the lens, and spoke. Her words went out across the capital, then to the surrounding cities, then to every corner of the Dominion that could still receive a signal. She spoke about the life debt. She spoke about Danny Cole. She said his name clearly and without shame. She told her people that a human soldier, a man with no blood ties to the Dominion, no obligation and no reason to stay, had stepped in front of a weapon to save her life. And now on this night he was standing in her palace bleeding for their people again, not because of tradition, not because of law, but because that was who he was. She said that if one human could bleed for the Dominion without hesitation, then the Dominion's strength had never been about purity of blood or the age of their civilization. It had always been about the willingness to stand for something greater than yourself. She asked her people to choose what the Dominion truly was. The broadcast rippled outward in military installations across the capital. Loyalist commanders who had been waiting uncertain heard the Empress's words and made their decision. Ships powered up, ground units mobilized. Tide began to turn. Within hours the Vale Sorath assault collapsed. Their support fractured as soldiers who had been told they were fighting for the Dominion's honor realized they were fighting against it. The blockade broke when Loyalist warships arrived from the outer defense ring. By dawn, the rebel leaders were in custody, and the capital was quiet. Danny was sitting on the floor of the eastern corridor when it ended. He was leaning against a wall, his armor cracked in 3 places, a bandage wrapped around his left arm where a piece of debris had cut him open. Taith sat beside him, equally exhausted. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Megan found him an hour later. She had a cut above her eyebrow and her uniform was burned along one sleeve. She sat down next to him and put her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while. 2 days after the battle, Danny stood before the Empress one final time. The great hall was scarred from the fighting. The walls were cracked. The floor was stained, but the Empress sat in her place as if nothing had changed, because the things that mattered hadn't. She told Danny that the Sham Voreth was fulfilled, not because of the battle, though his courage had saved lives. It was fulfilled because his presence had forced her people to ask a question they had been avoiding for centuries. What did honor truly mean when it was tested by someone they never expected? She offered him a choice. He could stay in the court as a permanent member with all the rights and standing that came with it, or he could return to Earth as the first human officially recognized as a friend of the Ether and Dominion, carrying a bond between two civilizations that nothing could break. Danny looked at her. He thought about the garden and the glowing plants and the quiet conversations about rain and stars. He thought about Megan. He thought about Earth. He told her he wanted to go home, but he said that if she ever needed him for anything, he would come back. She nodded. There was something in her expression that was warm and sad at the same time, and Danny understood it perfectly because he felt it too. As he turned to leave, Rick stepped forward. The High Sentinel stood in front of Danny and looked down at him with those sharp ancient eyes. Then he extended his arm and clasped Danny and LT Unk and GT Y's forearm in the ether. Warrior salute. It was a grip that said everything words couldn't. It was the first time Rick had ever offered that salute to a human. Danny returned the grip, nodded once, and walked out. Megan was waiting at the shuttle bay. She looked at him as he approached and asked him how it felt to accidentally reshape two civilizations. Danny shrugged and said he just didn't want to see anyone get shot. She laughed and told him he was still an idiot. Then she walked beside him onto the shuttle, and they went home. Behind them in the great hall, Empress Vathari's son sat quietly for a long time. Then she called for her scribes and ordered them to add a new chapter to the Dominion's sacred histories. It would begin with the words, "And the human stood where no other